Have you ever given everything to a cause only to realize you were just another replaceable name on a spreadsheet? That question echoed in my mind as I stood in front of the Joint Command Review Board, surrounded by faces that once saluted me, now avoiding my eyes. 22 years of service, meticulous, honorable, and unwavering, condensed into a 6-minute meeting and a single sentence. We're going in a different direction. The room was sterile. Strategic maps lined the walls. My commendations were framed on the hallway just outside. Yet none of that mattered now. The new direction had a name: Lieutenant Alex Halbridge, 29, law school graduate, 0 deployment time. But more importantly, he was the nephew of Senator William Halbridge, chairman of the Defense Oversight Committee. They called it modernizing the chain of command. I called it something else. I didn't speak, I didn't argue. In the Army, you learn early when a fight is already lost and when to change battlefields. Because what they didn't know was that one phone call I had made the night before had already opened a door they would never see coming. I wasn't going quietly. I just knew how to wait. My name is Major David Reece, born in Atlanta, raised by a Vietnam vet and a schoolteacher. Discipline came early, and excuses never lasted long in our house. I joined the Army at 20, passed Ranger School at 23, and by 30 I was coordinating forward operations in Kandahar. Over 2 decades I served in 7 deployments, built recon units from scratch, and led missions that never made the news but changed the course of real lives. I wasn't flashy. I didn't chase politics or promotion boards. I just did the work. Quietly. Consistently. I had turned volatile regions into stable routes, prevented insurgent ambushes with nothing but instinct and experience, and de-escalated tribal disputes that would have drawn blood without a word of press coverage. My record was clean, my evaluations glowing, and my men, they followed me because they trusted me, not because they had to. At Fort Rainer, I had trained some of the Army's most promising officers. I'd been tapped to design new leadership protocols, advised international allies on joint operations, and even briefed 2 NATO generals. But I never let the ribbons cloud the mission. My loyalty wasn't to politics. It was to the people on the ground, the ones doing the work, and that loyalty cost me. The final year before my reassignment, things started to shift. I noticed how often my input in tactical briefings was overlooked, how decisions were being made before meetings even began. Civilian consultants showed up with laminated slides and empty jargon, and suddenly, everything was about optics, not outcomes. Still, I kept my head down. I believed that integrity would outlast bureaucracy. I didn't expect a parade, but I didn't expect to be replaced by someone who had never led troops outside of a training simulation either. Alex Halbridge was the kind of officer who used command presence as a buzzword, but panicked the moment plans went off script. I had seen his file: glossy internships, Ivy League debates, and a summer in Geneva. But leadership isn't theory. It's earned in chaos, when plans fall apart and all you have is grit, instinct, and the trust of those beside you. I wasn't afraid of losing rank. I was afraid of what would happen to the men under his. And that's when I knew. I wasn't done serving. Just no longer under their flag. They called it a strategic transition, but the truth was far simpler. I was being replaced, not because I'd failed, not because I'd misstepped, but because someone with more influence decided it was time to make room for family. Lieutenant Alex Halbridge was introduced to the team with the kind of fanfare usually reserved for visiting diplomats. The base communications team released a memo about new leadership for a new era, complete with a photo of him shaking hands with the Fort Rainer commandant. No mention of the man who had held that role quietly, effectively, and without scandal for nearly a decade. He arrived in a tailored uniform, boots that had never seen mud, and a confidence that came not from battle-tested grit, but from years of political insulation. From day one, he acted like command was owed to him, not something to be earned. His first briefing opened with a quote from a management consultant. His first directive was to streamline morale reporting metrics. His second was to flatten the leadership structure to encourage innovation. None of it made operational sense, and worse, he didn't seem to care. I watched as junior officers who had trained under me were forced to nod along, pretending his words meant something. Some glanced my way, their eyes asking silent questions I couldn't answer. I had no seat at the table anymore. I was told to remain on base for the duration of my reassignment window, available for consultations, but otherwise excluded from strategy discussions. They dressed it up with respectful language, but I knew what it was, a placeholder assignment until they could quietly push me out without media noise. What stung wasn't the loss of authority, it was the quiet betrayal by those who had once relied on me. Colleagues avoided eye contact. Conversations hushed when I entered a room. Nobody wanted to be seen siding with the outgoing officer, not when his replacement had Senate backing. Alex brought in his own team within the first 2 weeks, civilian advisors from think tanks, a junior aide from his uncle's office, a public relations coordinator. They held more meetings than field briefings, and morale plummeted. But I stayed silent. Not out of weakness, out of calculation, because in my jacket pocket I still carried a coin. A challenge coin from a former commander now heading a private military firm overseas. He'd once told me, "If things ever go sideways, call me. I don't hire resumes. I hire men I'd follow into fire." I had a feeling it was time to make that call. The unraveling didn't happen overnight. It came in small, calculated increments, so subtle that most didn't even notice until it was too late. But I noticed. You don't spend 2 decades navigating military politics and battlefield uncertainty without learning how to read between the lines. The first sign was access. One morning, my clearance to certain briefing files was downgraded. No explanation given. A systems glitch, they said. Temporary, but it wasn't. Within days, my login credentials only worked for administrative reports. Then came the meeting exclusions. Tactical reviews I had attended for years suddenly became invite only. When I asked about it, I was told leadership was experimenting with a streamlined decision-making structure. Translation: I was no longer in the room. Then there were the whispers. Officers I had mentored, men and women I'd pulled out of near-fatal errors in the field, now avoided one-on-one conversations. Some stopped coming to my informal Friday morning strategy sessions. One of them, Captain Ortega, caught me in the hallway and said quietly, "Sir, they're watching who we talk to. I respect you, but I've got a kid at home." I didn't blame him. The message was clear. Proximity to me had become a liability. Meanwhile, Halbridge made his presence known in the most performative ways. He held morale events with press invited, started an internal leadership podcast that no one listened to, and insisted officers call him by his first name to build rapport. But when it came to real decisions, troop deployments, budget reallocation, logistics, he deferred to a team of civilian analysts with no field experience. He replaced 3 of our most seasoned unit leaders with candidates recommended by political allies. One of them, a major with 0 combat time, was given control of our rapid response division. I couldn't believe it. That team had handled hostage rescues in northern Syria. I documented everything, not for vengeance, for clarity, because I knew eventually someone would ask, "How did this happen?" But what pushed me over the edge wasn't a policy or promotion. It was the day I heard Halbridge laugh in a closed-door meeting, about me. One of my former aides had overheard it. "Reece? Yeah, he's old doctrine, outdated. We're writing a new chapter." He didn't know it yet, but he had just written his own downfall's first line. That night, I opened my desk drawer, took out the challenge coin, and sent a secure message to an old contact. I kept it simple. "Let's talk." They called it a farewell luncheon, but everyone knew what it really was, a quiet dismissal disguised as ceremony. It was scheduled for Friday at 1400 hours in the base's secondary conference room, not the main hall where real recognitions were usually held. No military band, no formation salute, just coffee, finger sandwiches, and a half-hearted PowerPoint slideshow made by someone who'd never seen me in uniform outside a base directory photo. I arrived in my Class A uniform, shoes shined, ribbon rack neat. If I was going to be pushed out, I'd walk out on my terms. Shoulders square, head high. A few of my former officers were there, standing stiffly in the corner, unsure whether to come shake my hand. Most of them didn't, not because they didn't want to, but because being seen talking to me now carried risk. And risk was a luxury few could afford on a military base where politics moved faster than policy. Colonel Vance gave a brief speech, reading word for word from a card. Major David Reece served the United States Army with distinction for 22 years. It was robotic, as if written by someone who'd Googled my career and summarized it in bullet points. He didn't mention Kandahar. He didn't mention Task Force Echo or the night we lost radio contact for 8 hours and still extracted every man from hostile territory. He didn't mention how I had rewritten half the training protocols they still used. Then Halbridge stepped up. He smiled like he was introducing a keynote speaker at a tech conference. We thank Major Reece for his contributions and are excited about the new ideas we'll be implementing going forward. Change is difficult, but necessary. We must evolve. And I believe the Army's future will be stronger for it. There was no applause, just a few nods. The kind you give out of obligation, not conviction. Afterwards, I shook hands with a few enlisted men who had quietly come to see me off. No commanders, no brass, just the people who mattered. I walked out of that room with a folded flag under one arm and a cardboard box under the other. My shadow stretched across the concrete walkway as I left the administration building, my home for the past 10 years, for the last time. That night, I didn't drink. I didn't rant. I just opened my laptop, clicked on the secure reply I'd received earlier, and read 3 words that changed everything. Let's meet Monday. The meeting took place at a nondescript office park on the outskirts of Arlington. No signs, no flags, just a plain glass door with a black keypad. A man named Eric Maddox met me in the lobby. He was lean, early 50s, and carried the kind of stillness you only find in people who've spent time in rooms without windows. We'd served briefly together in Mosul, years ago. He had been running intelligence for a special operations group while I managed field logistics. Back then we didn't talk much, but in this world silence was its own kind of respect. David, he said, shaking my hand with a firm grip. You look like someone who's just had the wind knocked out of him. I gave a half smile. That's one way to put it. He led me through a coded door down a hallway lined with photographs of operations that never made the news. Inside the conference room there was no slideshow, no presentation. Just a folder, a glass of water, and an opportunity. We've been watching things unravel at Fort Rainier, Eric said. You're not the only one asking questions, and frankly, we've lost confidence in their leadership pipeline. I stayed silent. He opened the folder. Ever heard of Aegis Sentinel Group? He asked. I had. Barely. A privately contracted operations and logistics firm working with both government and foreign agencies. Low profile, but with a reputation for cleaning up behind bureaucratic messes. I'd heard rumors they'd pulled off an extraction in East Africa that State Department teams failed to manage. We're expanding, he said. Inland strategy, command oversight, rapid reaction deployment support. We need someone to build the unit. Someone with field experience, but also the discipline to think long-term. And what makes you think I'm still interested? I asked, not because I wasn't, but because I needed to hear it. He didn't hesitate. Because I've seen what happens when men like you walk away. The system doesn't just lose a soldier, it loses a spine. I flipped through the contract terms. Executive leadership, full operational autonomy, oversight on recruitment, a say in mission scope, competitive salary, but more importantly, equity, real ownership. I closed the folder. What's the timeline? I asked. 2 weeks. We want to announce the division head before the next quarter. And Reece, if you join us, you won't be taking orders from politicians. You'll be taking command. And just like that, I remembered what it felt like to be needed for the right reasons. That night, back in my apartment, I sat by the window with the contract folder open beside me and an untouched cup of black coffee going cold on the table. Outside, Arlington's city lights blinked steady and indifferent like the quiet rhythm of duty. I wasn't thinking about titles or equity or revenge. I was thinking about loyalty, what it had cost me, and what it had built. I remembered Fallujah, 2006. My first time leading a live fire operation under full blackout conditions. We were escorting a humanitarian convoy through a corridor that intelligence said was clear. It wasn't. We got ambushed halfway through. 2 vehicles disabled, comms jammed, 1 man down. I called the shots that night not from a place of protocol, but instinct, and we made it out. Nobody talked about that mission afterward. There was no citation. Just a nod from the convoy lead and the knowledge that we'd done what was necessary. Then there was Kabul, 2013. A young private, Langston, froze under fire during a checkpoint dispute that escalated fast. He was supposed to be my rear cover, but he dropped his weapon and ducked. I covered him, finished the standoff, and later found him sitting alone behind the barracks, shaking. I didn't write him up. I trained him harder. By the time we rotated home, Langston was running point, on patrols, and had earned the respect of men twice his age. Last I heard, he made captain. Moments like those, they were my currency. Not medals, not promotions, but people. Trust. The kind of loyalty that grows only under pressure, when things fall apart and all that's left is the measure of who you are when no one's watching. I thought about the weekend I missed my sister's wedding to stay back and manage evac logistics after an earthquake hit northern Pakistan. The night I signed off payroll during a shutdown with a note, cover it from my bonus until we get reimbursed. I never mentioned it to anyone. I didn't need recognition. I needed results. And now, sitting in that quiet room, I understood something important. The Army had lost sight of what leadership really meant. They thought replacing me was removing a person from a post. What they didn't realize was they had severed every thread that held the operation together. I looked down at the contract again. Not just an offer, but a way back to purpose. Loyalty had nearly broken me. Now it might be what rebuilt me. While I weighed the offer in silence, chaos began to seep into Fort Rainier like a slow leak in a pressurized cabin. At first, it was subtle. Missed timelines, duplicated orders, delayed equipment drops. Then came the more visible fractures. A reconnaissance exercise in Nevada had to be aborted halfway through after Halbridge authorized a last-minute mission scope change without consulting logistics. Half the unit ended up stranded without fuel or comms coverage for 12 hours in 112-degree heat. It made local news, sanitized of course, but inside the ranks, the truth spread fast. Morale collapsed like a tent with a missing pole. Soldiers, who had once operated like clockwork under pressure, were now second-guessing protocols, waiting on conflicting approvals, or worse, sitting idle. Training ops turned into photo ops. Tactical briefings were replaced with leadership roundtables, led by civilian advisors who had never set foot in a combat zone. Halbridge, for his part, didn't seem to notice, or care. He doubled down on his polished narrative. Innovation, modernization, vision. He published essays on internal message boards about redefining mission metrics and reimagining readiness through empathy-first strategy. The troops weren't inspired. They were exhausted. I started getting quiet messages, encrypted, informal, from former colleagues. Some were requests for advice. Others were confessions of concern. One came from Sergeant First Class Denise Park, who had once led logistics coordination under my command in Jordan. Her message was short. We're unraveling. Nobody's saying it out loud, but the senior NCOs are watching everything slip. Then came the report that sealed it. A critical supply route in North Africa, one I had personally designed and refined over years, was compromised after Halbridge's new logistics officer rerouted assets without considering seasonal terrain, shifts. What should have been a 48-hour delivery window turned into an 8-day delay, forcing 2 Allied units into emergency rationing. The after-action review was brutal, and this time the brass noticed. But even then, no one moved to replace him. The politics were too thick, the optics too fragile, so instead they tried to contain the damage. Spin reports, redirect press, shuffle blame. What they didn't realize was that trust, once lost, doesn't trickle back in. It bleeds out, fast and permanent. And I knew then, Halbridge hadn't just replaced me. He had inherited a machine he couldn't operate. It was only a matter of time before it tore itself apart, and when it did, I'd be waiting. Not with anger, but with precision. Just as the seams at Fort Rainer began splitting beyond repair, the next unexpected message came. Not from Eric Maddox. This time, but from someone I hadn't heard from in nearly a decade. Colonel Evelyn Sharp. We'd served together briefly in Eastern Europe, where she ran diplomatic protection units and I handled field ops. She was as sharp as her name implied. Reputation for zero tolerance, but known for spotting talent before the system did. Now she was heading up an elite joint task force known as Ravenhold, a covert multi-agency initiative that didn't operate on org charts or official funding streams. Quiet, effective, invisible. Her message was short and encrypted. Reece, I hear you're between flags. I have an opening, not a job, a mission. If you're done with optics, come build something that actually works. Dinner tomorrow, 1900 hours. No obligations. That phrase, not a job, a mission, stayed with me. Because that's what I'd been missing. Something that mattered. Not spreadsheets and policy reviews. Not promotions tied to political capital. But a real assignment. Something that required judgment, not just protocol. We met in a low-lit back room of a steakhouse in Alexandria. No entourage, no formal brief. She laid it out plainly. Ravenhold is expanding a domestic operations arm. Rapid response, threat triage, and internal contingency control. We need someone who understands command not from a podium, but from the dirt. Someone who can build a team from nothing and have it functioning under stress in 60 days. She didn't mention my dismissal, didn't pity it. She respected it, as proof. You got replaced by someone who doesn't know the weight of a bad call. We don't make those mistakes. Not twice. Then she slid a second file across the table. This is a list of candidates. Former officers, NCOs, some you might remember. We're giving you recruitment control, training, strategic autonomy. You pick your team. You shape the protocol. There was a catch. There always is. Ravenhold operated in the shadows. Zero media, zero credit. You made your mark by results alone. No ribbons, no ceremony. But I didn't need a stage. I needed a battlefield that hadn't been hollowed out by politics. I left that dinner with 2 files in my hand, Aegis Sentinel's contract in one, Ravenhold's mission charter in the other, and suddenly I wasn't deciding whether I still had a place. I was deciding which war to lead next. I didn't sleep much that night, not because of doubt, but because of clarity. For the first time in months, I wasn't stuck wondering what had gone wrong. I was building what came next. By morning, I'd made my decision. I called Eric Maddox and thanked him for the offer at Aegis Sentinel. It's a strong team, I told him, but I've been offered something that feels less like a position and more like a purpose. He understood. Men like us always do. By noon, I was sitting in a secure Ravenhold facility reviewing dossiers. My future team. Names I hadn't seen in years began reappearing. Park, Langston, Ortega. Sharp had been watching the same decay I had, and like me, she didn't believe in salvaging what was already too corroded to repair. She believed in starting over, with people who still had their moral compass intact. Within 3 days, I had handpicked a dozen operators. Every one of them had either been disillusioned by the system or sidelined like I had been. None of them wanted vengeance. They wanted to serve on their own terms. We started meeting quietly at an off-grid training site outside Quantico. No uniforms, no insignia, just purpose. Meanwhile, word began to spread, quietly at first, then faster. 3 defense contractors who'd worked exclusively with Fort Rainer sent discreet inquiries to Ravenhold. Apparently, Halbridge's failure in Africa had triggered a review of all their operational partners. One liaison wrote, "We prefer leaders who can still read terrain, not just spreadsheets." They didn't name me, but they didn't have to. I was already in discussions with 2 other client agencies to redirect assets under our new Ravenhold division. I didn't have to pitch anything. My name was the pitch. Then the first domino fell. Langston, now my second in command, brought news. One of the Army's key intelligence liaisons had pulled their access contract from Fort Rayner. Why? Because their field agents refused to work under Halbridge's unit after back-to-back failures. I knew what that meant. The cracks were no longer hidden. They were structural. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. When something falls under its own weight, all you have to do is stay out of the way. Halbridge's command had weeks left, months if they managed to bury the right reports. But by then, we'd already be operational, and this time, no one could replace me. Not because I was untouchable, but because I was building something no one else understood how to run. It began with a memo, an internal audit report from Army. Central Command quietly leaked to a Defense Oversight Journal. The headline read, "Operational instability at Fort Rayner raises strategic concerns." It didn't name names, but the implications were clear. Halbridge's command had mismanaged 3 logistics operations, caused 2 Allied contract withdrawals, and was under review for performance-related leadership concerns. In military language, that's a siren. Within 48 hours, the Senate Armed Services Committee called for a closed-door hearing. That was the first fracture. The second came from within. A group of mid-level officers submitted a joint grievance, unprecedented, citing unsafe mission parameters and breakdowns in chain-of-command accountability. Among them was Captain Denise Park. I read the filing myself. It was detailed, measured, and damning. She had included timelines, communication logs, and eyewitness statements. The Army tried to keep it quiet, but word spreads, especially when the people talking have nothing left to lose. Then came the press. A former analyst-turned-whistleblower gave an anonymous interview to a major outlet. He painted a picture of a command more interested in PR than operational effectiveness, a leader who prioritized perception over preparation. By the time the story broke nationally, Halbridge was already in damage control mode. He issued a bland, rehearsed statement, called it a targeted smear. But no one was buying it, not anymore. The final blow came 2 weeks later. The Department of Defense released a formal restructuring plan, and in the middle of it, buried between logistics reallocations and strategic realignments, was a single line: leadership transition at Fort Rayner effective immediately. Just like that, Halbridge was gone. Not with a court-martial, not with disgrace, just removed, folded into some other department with a neutral title and no real authority. The Senate had no appetite for scandal, especially when the real damage had already been done. I didn't celebrate, but I won't lie. I felt something, not revenge, not even satisfaction, just a quiet sense of justice settling into place. A reminder that systems, no matter how entrenched, are still vulnerable to the weight of their own arrogance. And Fort Rayner? It's a ghost of what it was. Most of the senior officers have been reassigned. The base is now under temporary command, and 3 major training contracts have shifted to Ravenhold. Not because we asked, because when real leadership disappears, everyone starts looking for the ones who still remember how to lead. 6 months later, I stood on the tarmac of a private airfield outside Colorado Springs, watching a Ravenhold transport jet taxi down the runway. On board were 2 teams we had trained from the ground up, operators handpicked, sharpened by months of joint field simulations, now heading out on a real-world deployment that would never make headlines, but would quietly prevent a crisis halfway across the world. I wasn't wearing a uniform. There was no rank on my collar, but every person on that flight knew exactly who I was and what I stood for. Ravenhold had grown faster than even Sharp anticipated. What began as a discrete operations arm had evolved into a full-scale field command model adopted by 3 allied intelligence agencies and 2 private defense coalitions. Our retention rate was unmatched. Why? Because we weren't rebuilding broken systems. We were creating a new one, based on competence, clarity, and command earned in sweat, not signatures. Langston now ran our international operations desk. Park was overseeing advanced recon strategy for multinational response teams. Ortega, after years of bureaucratic exile, was back in charge of the kind of unit he was born to lead. Every one of them had been cast aside by a system that didn't understand value, unless it could put it in a press release. And Fort Rayner. Last I heard, they'd been downgraded to a regional training facility. Most of their former command staff had transitioned to advisory roles, which in government speak means they'd been shelved somewhere quiet. Halbridge, according to rumor, was now working as a strategic consultant for a policy think tank in D.C., far away from any battlefield that might test him. I never reached out. Never needed to. My silence said more than any confrontation ever could. Instead, I focused forward. My team, my mission, and the legacy we were building. I had spent years believing that loyalty to the system would protect me. I was wrong. What protects you, what truly lasts, is the loyalty you build person to person, one moment at a time, under fire, under pressure, when no one's looking. I didn't need my old title back. I had something better. Respect that couldn't be given or taken by rank, influence earned without politics. And a new chapter that didn't begin with orders. It began with purpose. And this time I was the one writing it. What happened at Fort Rayner isn't unique to the military. It's a reflection of something we've all seen, in boardrooms, classrooms, offices, when loyalty, experience, and quiet strength are cast aside in favor of flashier, safer, more politically convenient choices. And when that happens, collapse is only a matter of time. Leadership isn't about who talks the loudest in the meeting. It's about who shows up when no one else will. It's about the person who fixes the problem without needing credit. The one who carries the weight even when no one's watching. I didn't rebuild my career to prove anything. I did it because people were still depending on leadership that worked, not leadership that looked good on paper. And I've learned this. The world may overlook those who keep their heads down, but the mission never forgets who gets the job done. If this story reminded you of someone, a leader who never got the recognition they deserved, tell us in the comments. Their story might deserve to be told next. And if you're drawn to stories like this, real people, hard choices, quiet justice, consider subscribing, because we're just getting started.